But you know, in Italy, there were the Etruscans. You should get someone to talk about the Etruscans. They're quite interesting. Well, they found in Etruria in Italy a model of a sheep's liver made of bronze with writing all over it, which showed that, and that is undoubtedly based on a Babylonian example, that somebody must have gone to Babylon or encountered a Babylonian liver diviner who taught him how to do it, and they made a local one with Etrurian writing on. So that's an example of something which hardly exists in our world, which at one time was very, very significant, not only being a Mesopotamian conception and invention, but also it was disseminated outside. Other people adopted it, other people took up the same practice. And of course, divination about what's going to happen is not a dead thing in the world. A lot of people practice astrology, for example, which is a form of divination, and many other things as well in different parts of the world. There are all sorts of things like people race cockroaches and see who's going to win, and all that kind of stuff. But it's part of the great story of humanity, and it's really rather funny, rather fascinating as well.
It is. All of that is. And it's interesting to see how one area so much could start from. Now, I heard that Western astrology originated in this area.
That's correct.
Alexander the Great took it from the Mesopotamians, and the Romans and the Greeks just gave it a fine tuning.
Yep. Well, yes, fine tuning is perhaps a bit strong, but the zodiac was invented in Mesopotamia. The path of 12 in the heavens, that was a Babylonian invention, and that was definitely taken over by the Greeks into their own thinking. And also they had a lot of other, as I mentioned, that they could predict eclipses. They had a very scientific approach to astronomy, and we can tell that in about the 3rd century BC, Greek scholars who had been working on things like this on their own went to Babylon because they knew that the Babylonian or the Chaldean astrologers, as they called them, had experience over many, many generations and very extensive records. And they went to Babylon in order to meet their counterparts and to try and get some idea of all the information they had, because the Greeks didn't have any data. They had great clever minds, and they were very thoughtful about phenomena, very philosophically alert, the clever people who did all that sort of thing, but they didn't have observations like the Babylonians did over generations and generations of hard facts, and that's what they wanted. And we know that this is what happened, that they interacted with these people. They got from them a sort of dose of information, quite an extensive dose of information, and we can prove that this is what happened for one simple reason, that the Babylonians, who invented numbers and counting very early on, before 3000 BC, they did all their counting in 60s. See, we do it in tens. We have decimal counting, probably because we have 10 digits. But the Babylonians, the Sumerians before them, they counted in 60s or sexagesimal counting. And in some respects, if you use a base 60 instead of a base 10, it gives you a greater degree of flexibility in calculation. Anyway, the thing that's important about it is when the Greeks in the 3rd century went to Babylon and they worked in the libraries with their Babylonian counterparts, and they explained and they shared information, all the data that they got from the Babylonians was in 60s, not in 10s. And that is why we have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour today, and 360 degrees in a circle. Because why would you do that? Adults never think about it, but sometimes children ask really big questions like, why do we have 60 seconds in a minute? Why is it 60? Well, it's because all the stuff that the Greeks got, and they copied things out I'm sure, in the libraries and took them home to work on, was in this system. And it's still with us on a anybody who has a watch still has 60 minutes on it. It's rather amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, the time I wish I had kept one of my pocket watches on me, take it out.
That would have been a good move.
But that is that's great that to know that that's where that came from, because they were counting in 60s.
And there's no doubt about it. So there was a time when everybody had such a watch on their wrist. And as you said, well, if you look at the watch on your wrist, but if you do that now, people say, I haven't got a watch, I only have a mobile. And it's no good with a mobile because you can't tell. It just tells you what the time is. So it's a whole different thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Good. Lovely.
Yeah. So how are the relations between Mesopotamia and Babylon?
Well, Babylon, so if you have the ancient Mesopotamia and you have the Babylonians who live in the southern part of the country and the Assyrians up in the north. So the Babylonian half of the country, Babylon was the capital city of Babylonia. So Nebuchadnezzar, the famous king in the Bible, he was king in Babylon, which was a huge city, like it was like Manhattan or something in ancient terms. And that's where the big temple, stepped temple tower, the ziggurat, was in the middle of Babylon, and the king's palace and temples, and it was a huge city, and that's Babylon. And we know the name because the Greeks went there, and the Greeks wrote down the name, and Babylon survived into modern times. And because the site, of course, is still there, it was gigantic, as I say, it was like Manhattan. And there've been excavations there for a very long period of time, and they found part of Nebuchadnezzar's palace with amazing bricks, with lions and bulls marching along in enameled bricks along the corridor, which is now in Berlin. And if you ever go to the museum in Berlin and you walk between those columns of animals, you could imagine you're going to visit Nebuchadnezzar, who's king of the world, and you hoping like mad that he wasn't cross with you, because it would be rather intimidating by the time you got there, because the lions are life-size and their eyes are huge and their teeth are like this. And you can just imagine walking down there led by one of the king's officials. If you hadn't paid up your tribute like a good king, and you've been a bit naughty, you'd probably be shaking with fear by the time you got in front of Nebuchadnezzar, which is presumably the idea.
Oh my, yeah, that's a new take on that. I remember in Boston when I was going to school, I was able to go into the Museum of Fine Arts for free for being a student,
Yeah.
and I got to walk through the Mesopotamia and Babylon section.
Right.
And
Exactly.
yeah, it was a small room, and they actually had a couple of the Anunnaki statue or carvings, stone carvings, for probably about as tall as the door
I know.
frame.
Yes.
And then they had a couple of these large bull and lion statues, and these things were massive,
They
huge.
were. And also, when they had those sculptures on the wall with those divine figures standing flat along the wall, well, in original terms, of course they didn't have electric light. Obviously, they had oil lamps and things like that. And if you walk down the passages of the palace at night, you'd have a lamp with you. But so as you got near, these things would come out of the wall, shadowy, and then as you went past, they'd recede into the dark. And that's like something, when you're a kid, when you have these ideas in your mind, it must have been like that. It was never bright light like it is in the museum where you can see everything. It was only if you went up to it with your lamp to examine it carefully. So that's an interesting thought, I think.
Or if the moon was full.
Yes, or if the moon was there. Yes, they were always looking out for the new moon. It was a very important time. So
Yeah.
well, I'm glad
That,
you went there. See, when you went there when you were a boy or a student, made an impression on your mind. That's the exact point. Very good. See, like
yeah.
going to Boston. Yeah.
Yeah. It was. Now I want to go back, see it all over again.
Yes. Well, you have to come and see the British Museum, or there's some stuff in Chicago, or where else is there? Philadelphia. They have interesting things. I mean, they have very good museums of extraordinary things that would come out of the ground.
Yeah,
And I
hopefully
find it,
2024, I will be able to take a trip back to the United Kingdom and
good.
visit everyone that I've been interviewing over the last year. Now, can you give me an idea too about the geography at the time? Was ancient Iraq at this time very much like a desert, like it is
Well,
today, or
well, it's mixed. In the south, there's a lot of desert now, and there was then, but they had the massive rivers of the Euphrates and Tigris, which come down from the far north, and the water is very pure and with nutrients. And they found out very early how to take one of the branches of the river and make canals of it and smaller canals of it. And they learned how to harness the water to irrigate the land. And the minute you do that, it comes green, and next minute you've got luxuriant growth and everything. And they were brilliant at doing it. So some of the ancient cities, it's a funny matter, but in Iraq, when you travel around, you see a sort of great mound in the horizon in many directions, and they're not natural. They are where they're ancient sites where people lived for such a long time, sometimes different populations on top of another, gradually it built up. So it's a great archaeological mass of stuff. And sometimes these desert, these mounds where people lived, ancient cities, are completely desert all around today. But when they were populated, they must have had canals running and trees and luxurious. And so when the man stops doing it, it stays, goes back to a desert. But in the north of Iraq, it's quite different. It's green and luxuriant, and it's a different landscape. So there's a great deal of contrast between it. But the clever thing about the Sumerians who lived in the south was they really knew how to utilize their environment to the best possible way.
yeah, that is incredible.
It's interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. Very like that's how they were able to work the land in that sense. That really is remarkable, the human ingenuity. Um, I guess I might make this the second to last question. What other stories do we have anything beyond the Enuma Elish or the Epic of Gilgamesh in terms of the stories or the mythos translated within the ancient beliefs?
Those are the most famous things, and they're best preserved because Gilgamesh has, as I said, 12 whole tablets of stuff, and the creation epic has 7 tablets of stuff. So there's a lot of lines, and because so many people have been interested in them, lots of bits have been identified, and sometimes fragments are joined on and things like that. So they are the most accessible texts. They're best preserved, and they're translated into modern languages. There are other things as well. There's quite a lot of stories in Sumerian, which have been translated in. There are sort of collections of literature in translation, and they didn't have stories in the sense of modern stories. Many of them are mythological, if you want to call them mythological, or about ancient kings. But I'm not so sure about this word mythology, because in the modern world, myth and mythology carries with it the idea that something isn't true. You say the myth of this, or that sort of idea. Someone makes a suggestion, it's just a myth, so it's not something you should credit. But that doesn't apply at all to ancient mythology, and I think for in modern terms, it's not the best word to use. I think that they had a good sense of history, because they kept the royal inscriptions of their kings, and they made lists of kings and how many years they reigned, things like that, so they could look them up, and the fathers and sons and grandsons, and how many years they had. And so very systematic. So they had the backbone of history back to quite early on in their time in a clear way. And then before that, there was a period without history, and then of course there was the Great Flood, which went over them. There was a time before the flood. But what we call mythology, I think, was what they thought there was their best idea of their ancient history. I think it wasn't made up sort of thing. It wasn't an artificial thing. It was traditional stories from early times, as people understood them, or and they transmitted them and they developed them. But they weren't. It's not that people believed them or didn't believe them. In the sense of it, in the modern sense, it was just part of their traditional inheritance, something like that. They were taken for granted. Those stories, they're part of human psychology, and partly as a result of storytellers, I think, as I was explaining before, because people who can talk out like actors. If an actor reads something, people are completely silent. If a normal person reads something, it's just boring because they don't know how to project material in a way that commands attention. And I'm sure with traditional storytellers, but this was the same thing, that they had down to a fine art the way of taking their audience with them, and they'd all like that when it was something frightening, and so these stories were from childhood and adulthood, they were part of their apparatus, So not all of them were written down, of course, but we can see with Gilgamesh, for example, which is so long, that what was originally separate tales were worked together into one big narrative before they had written history, when they had the dates. But I mean, they knew, for example, how long very early kings ruled, and what their son was called and what their grandson was called. Because they collected all these historical accounts. I'm king so and so. They never threw anything away, and they made them into a sort of historical structure. So they had to have some idea of what existed before the structured history. That's how that works, I think.
Yes, that really is. And so our last question: do you have a message for future generations?
Well, my message to future generations is this: that if you spend any time looking into this sort of resource, as I say, what comes out of it, at least to my mind, is that the people there are like people today, and their lives are subjected to the same things that people are today, and they dealt with them as best they could, as people do today. So there's a great kinship to be derived from looking at these members of the human race from a much earlier time, because it's reassuring in a sense that we're all in the same boat. But there's another side to the thing, that the more people know about what's happened in the past, the more intelligently they can deal with the future. So, for example, if you have any kind of philosophical leaning, it is very difficult to imagine that it is still the case in the world that warfare goes on. And boy, does it go on, and it's going on now. And you would think that with all the things that have happened, everybody would know that warfare and killing is not the answer to anything. You would think that would be too obvious for words, but they've never learned the lesson. And the thing is that the human race never, ever profits from its own history. It never learns anything from its own history. There are no lessons that people say, whatever you do, whatever we're going to do, we're never going to have another war. Because if everybody said that, then there wouldn't be any. And the politicians who think, oh, it's time we had a war, it's a good idea, or it's to do with commerce, or it's to do with this, that, and the other, is wicked. It's a wicked thing. And the tragedy of the human race, as far as I understand it, is it's never, ever profited from its own history. And that is something which we should do. Like when you put the wrong person to be president of the United States, for example, theoretically speaking, what a disaster it is for everybody. And if you have a warmonger in charge of a state and absolute power, what a disaster it is for everybody. These people in the world are like microbes. We know how to deal with microbes. We invent things to get rid of viruses. They are a kind of virus, and they make everybody else's life unhappy. Everybody else's life unhappy. So this is a complete imbalance and madness in the world. And I think if you find out about all the kings that died of poisoning in bed, and all the people who lived in the countryside were farmers and priests and nuns and all these people who got around with their lives, and then there was the plague and a war and it's a terrible thing how vulnerable human beings are. And it's one of the things that impresses upon me, knowing about all this early stuff, is although the human beings haven't changed, nor has their way of preventing the things that could be prevented changed.
Thank you, Dr. Finkel.
It's a pleasure. I'm glad to meet you.